You may know if you're a regular listener to or viewer of this program, we like to keep folks apprised of folks. I sounded like Joe Biden there. I can never use that word again. We like to keep people apprised of groups out there that are doing what I and we consider to be really great work. And one of the groups I've wanted to cover for a while is PDA, Progressive Democrats of America. I became aware of them first some years ago in my original political activism and writing, more aware of them when I worked for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 campaign because they were so instrumental in making that happen. And they continue to be on my radar and should be on yours if they're not already. So here to join us now to tell us a little bit more about what PDA is up to and maybe what's going on with the left in general is Alan Minsky. Alan is the executive director of Progressive Democrats of America. He also comes out of a broadcasting background. He was a program director at KPFK in Los Angeles, for example, and has produced a lot of radio. So he knows this end of the business as well, too. But before we go any further, Alan, welcome to the program.
It is absolutely great to be here, Richard. So thank you for inviting me and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, same here. And why don't we start with this? For folks who don't know exactly what PDA is, I'm not sure that my introduction cleared that up very well. So why don't we start with who are you guys?
Well, we were founded in 2004, and PDA is an organization which is very, throughout its history, certainly for its first decade, was very much associated with the founding head of PDA, Tim Carpenter. And the backbone of PDA came out of the Dennis Kucinich campaign, with some people shifting over from the Howard Dean campaign in 2004. Dean, of course, had the line, the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And, you know, it's right now we live in a very intense political phase of American history and global history, and it can be hard to think back to even before the Bernie Sanders campaign at this point. And remember that the Democratic Party, in the noughts, did not have a very active and vibrant progressive wing. There certainly were active social justice movements that were going on in the United States of America, of course, a very powerful anti-war movement. But the Democratic Party itself, not just in terms of war and peace issues, but also in a more pronounced way with economic issues, was not the party that it is hopefully becoming today following the Sanders campaign, following the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Well, PDA was founded in 2004, again, with Tim Carpenter as the leader, with the politics of the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, with the politics of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and with the active goal of bringing those politics into the Democratic Party. Obviously, in 2000, there had been the Nader campaign. And, we can debate American political history, the role of third parties in American political history. But when you look at it broadly, the reality has been consistently in this country with our first past the post system that the system has always collapsed into a two-party system. There's, of course, the one episode where the Whig Party disappears and instantaneously the Republican Party, led pretty quickly by Abraham Lincoln, replaces it. So we have this two-party system. And if you have, and you also have this paradox where it's not a paradox, it's actually wholly predictable with the way that money operates in our system. But a study was done by a political scientist at Princeton, a political scientist at Northwestern in 2014, that just showed when you look at public polling and where the American public is in terms of policy after policy, those positions are not adopted by American public policy. The positions that are adopted are the positions that are supported by the wealthy and the powerful, and even really particularly the wealthy Americans. And the only time you get progressive legislation is on those occasions when the wealthy are supporting progressive policies. Now, that means we have progressive policies that are being passed that contrast incredibly with what people want to see in terms of what passes for legislation, what becomes law and policy in the United States. And it is basically not represented inside the two-party system. PDA was founded explicitly to represent those interests of the people and to bring progressive politics into the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, of course, being wholly closed off to such things. and therefore to try to change the way American society operates with a pragmatic, realistic realization that we have this two-party system and we need to have progressive politics, not just in the Democratic Party, but be the dominant mode of the Democratic Party.
So here, I get everything you're saying, and I largely support it. But here's let's start at the 60,000-foot level, Alan Minsky here, which is for many years, for example, I was not a member of the Democratic Party. I left in the mid 2000s, I think. Now I'm a little hazy. At the time, was a California resident. California moved to the more or less open primary system it had, so I didn't need to be a Democrat in order to have my voice heard and in the internal workings of the party. I was disinvited from a different progressive Democratic group at that point, interestingly enough, when my party registration changed, which opens up a whole other area of conversation. But there's this whole debate on the left, and the debate is, there are those who say, no, the Democratic Party is both corrupt and corrupting, and that you can't be in it without it, sort of subtly undermining your idealism. There's the part there's the viewpoint that says you don't get anything done even of a mildly progressive nature unless you are in and loyal to that party. And then there is what I would call my view now. I re-registered as a Democrat when I moved back east, partially because I was, supporting Ben Jealous for governor in Maryland, and wanted to help Ben in the primary every way I could, including voting for him. But I guess where I come down on it, is it possible to identify as a progressive Democrat and be a Democrat, be in the Democratic Party, I guess the way Thoreau said to be in the world, in it but not of it, if you get what I'm saying? What are your, you know what I'm saying, right?
Yes, of course. Of course, the goal is to take the party over by the progressives. I mean, of course, we don't want to be inside a party that represents the interests of the business elite. Clearly, the history of the Democratic Party shifted from the 70s. By the time you get to the 90s, you have Bill Clinton as president. The whole DLC trajectory transformed the party. Not that it was perfect before by any measure. And we certainly had a whole bunch of, shenanigans around things like the McGovern campaign and the 1968 election. So those were going on back in those days, too. Look, when we're faced with endemic social problems as we are in the United States, right? We have endemic racism. We have the homeless crisis. We have the situation right now with the right-wing move to eliminate choice for women. We have, of course, the global climate emergency. How are these issues going to be addressed? Social justice activism is a force. PDA was founded to have an inside-outside strategy, providing a conduit into the halls of legislation for social justice movements. So we're not divorced from that. But of course, yes, we, in a sense, you can look at it now like we're a second party inside the Democratic Party. And that is what organizations like Our Revolution, who are partners with PDA, are looking to achieve in the wake of the Sanders campaign and in the wake of that momentum continuing following the midterm elections, where, of course, the highest profile freshman congressperson is a member of DSA. And we have partnerships with organizations like DSA. And on, issue by issue, we also work with organizations that, lean progressive but aren't explicitly so, like, Indivisible and Move On. And again, the object is to transform the Democratic Party into a party that fights for progressive public policy positions. I understand we are not there yet. In fact, we are not there, even close to being there in terms of achieving any of the 2016 Sanders agenda, any of the 2018 Ocasio-Cortez agenda in American society. I mean, in some state and localities, we've seen advances, but generally, the reality is as much as there is enthusiasm and excitement for the progressive left in the United States to a greater degree than any time during my adult life. And PDA was the sort of trailblazing organization in achieving that. And thanks to the work of Tim Carpenter, the previous executive, Donna Smith, and all the great staff members and PDA people across the entire country. But we haven't achieved anything yet. We have to be realistic about that, and it is a big, heavy lift to break through, not only in the Democratic Party, but to achieve that public policy, and that's what we fight for. I want to go a little step further, though, in terms of what you said, and now I'm going to probably tick some people off, but so be it. This is politics. We have to, we have to struggle. We have to fight. We have to make our case. I think, okay, to look at something like the climate emergency, but really every other issue under the sun, from voting rights, civil rights issues, economic justice issues, across the board, every issue imaginable in the United States. But I think the really stark component comes with something like the climate emergency. Look, if you're not inside the Democratic Party fighting to elect progressives inside the Democratic Party, there is no other avenue to address these issues. By any measure, if you look at the science and the analysis of scientists, government regulation and federal government, national government regulation is going to be required to tackle this. And so, if you're being not willing to participate in trying to have the Democratic Party basically become a progressive party, one that truly responds to the science of the climate emergency, I hate to say it, but I really think you're part of the problem too.
Well, okay, so let's address that, because I think it's a fascinating question, and I think it's one that a lot of us on the left are struggling with. I think that there are those, I forget who said, give me, give me those who write the poems of a country, and I care not who make its laws. Now, I won't go that far, because I think that change is made in many ways on the legislative level. But then at the other end of the spectrum, I was very struck, for example, by Hillary Clinton's response to a Black Lives Matter activist who interrupted one of her, or I think it was, there were a couple incidents. I think this was a meeting with some Black Lives Matter advocates where she basically said, if you want change to happen, the only way that change happens is through legislation. And I think I think you nailed it, Alan Minsky, when you talked about an inside-outside strategy.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Oh, don't get me wrong. I mean, social justice activism, environmental activism, on the example I gave, the activism against the just absolute criminality of the American justice system, which is a human rights abomination of the first order, okay? That stands with any human rights abominations that are transpiring actively in this world. In fact, the mass caging of human beings inside the United States over the post-1960s, 70s, 80s, up to the present, and ongoing in the present, with its sort of corporate logic-driven appetite to make sure that all these prison cells remain filled, is one of the great human rights violations and ongoing violations and episodes of human rights violations in the history of modernity. And I mean, you just look at the numbers and the continuation of the numbers. At what point do we have to acknowledge as a society that Stalin's gulags, more people died inside Stalin's gulags that died, and hard labor was there and all, but it lasted about 8 years, at which point, when something goes on for decade after decade after decade, with more people incarcerated than any country in the world has ever seen, do we recognize that this is an utter and absolute abomination that needs to be rectified. And we need social justice activism, and we need to empower that social justice activism. But again, that's what PDA has always done, trying to provide a conduit, making people known that we exist as a conduit so that we can create the legislation and public policy to radically transform the society in the ways it needs to be.
And again, we're talking with Alan Minsky, Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America. And I get it, and I'm with you. I think that what's fascinating to me about all of this, in looking back at successful movements, is it always has been inside outside. I mean, there was briefly a historical debate a year or two ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, who was more responsible for the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson or Martin Luther King. I would argue that law, which of course now is being eviscerated in some ways by Republicans, but that law could not have been passed without both of them, right? So there's a partnership underway here. How, as a matter of action and by the way, when it comes to taking over the Democratic Party, also, Alan Minsky, I'm 100% with you that that the job has started, the task has started. I would even argue, I don't know how you feel about it, but from PDA's point of view, so far it's been a lot more successful than anyone might have expected in 2004 or in 2015. This progressive shift in the Democratic Party in changing the conversation, in changing the dynamics of the party. But I would also agree with you that we're a long way from making that happen. That you know, the establishment still has a lot of control, most control over this party. So what do you see as the next steps in changing this party from what it is, however one characterizes that, to an instrument of change?
Yeah, actually, we're talking on a day right now where we just saw that Tom Perez said there won't be a climate debate, that the DNC will not sponsor a climate debate in the among the debates that will happen between the 6,700 Democratic people who are running for the nomination for the Democratic presidency. Obviously, there's a lot of chaos inside the Democratic Party, but I actually want to just say one thing, because I don't want to understate a few of the things that PDA emphasizes. I just noticed I failed to mention U.S. foreign policy. Again, endemic, almost an analog to the situation of mass incarceration. We have these foreign wars, these foreign engagements that are never ending. And, it fades in and fades out of being something that's debated, even with the progressive upsurge in the Democratic Party. And PDA, having been founded during the Bush-Cheney years, remains a staunch advocate for the disengagement from these foreign engagements and a radical reconfiguration of U.S. foreign policy. And of course, a critic of Pentagon spending, et cetera, with the advocacy for the reallocation of those funds for the social good. But what happens next is the question, and how can we proceed and win this? Well, I do think as PDA, and I've come into the position, I've been in the position of executive director for about 9 months now, and we have a goal that is very targeted towards January 21st, 2021. And that's when we want to see in place at the federal level and increasingly at the state and local level, more progressives holding seats in legislatures and Congress, and hopefully at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And we want to have the mechanism in place. And what does PDA do if that's the case? Well, we have chapters across the country, and we actually are quite a unique organization in that we not only are involved in advocacy on Capitol Hill, we really organize to advocate at the local offices of federal officials as well. So every Congress office, we do, national letter drops every month on issues, sometimes more than one a month. And we watch and see particularly which Democrats, we see who's being naughty, who's being nice, and we keep track of that. And we hope to have progressives either see the transformation of Democrats who've been elected, who haven't been particularly progressive, become more progressive, or of course we will, and we are a federal PAC, so we support candidates, including candidates who will primary Democrat incumbents. And we champion when a progressive runs, and of course we particularly champion and love when they defeat a blue dog or right-wing Democrat. So that's the strategy going forward. But we are right now in the circumstances, and this goes with the fact that even with all the progressive momentum, and it's funny, we've talked about all this. I don't think I've said the word Trump yet. I haven't said McConnell yet. I haven't talked about the rise of the far right across other liberal democracies in the world. It's a very, very difficult and extremely troubling time that we're living through politically across the world. And the truth is, of course, without the change in the presidency to at least a Democrat, we're not going to see anything done in terms of progressive policy. And similarly, with McConnell fully controlling the Senate, he will, of course, block any meaningful progressive legislation. So holding on to the House is essential, winning back the Senate, and not just having a Democrat win at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but having a true progressive. That is something that we'll work for. But we are also working, while all of that is going on, to get chapter growth going, to get our focus, down across the country at every congressional office, to have a PDA presence, to work in coordination with progressive legislators, and to work in coordination with social justice movements to focus upon achieving progressive policy and pressuring members of Congress to support progressive policy across the board. So that's what we'll be doing now to get into a broader analysis of the political moment and how things stand in terms of the prospects of having a progressive Democrat win the nomination of the party. And also, what it would mean for the United States to take a meaningful, left progressive turn for the world. We're hopeful that if we do achieve a progressive revolution in the United States of America, that will have a transformative politics on the world and really be a powerful message against the rise of the far right across the world.
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. And again, we're talking with Alan Minsky, Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America. I think there is no question that if the United States can take a dramatic move in a progressive direction, that it will have immensely constructive repercussions around the world. And I think also we can draw inspiration from some of our allies around the world who are fighting some of the same struggles in their home countries. Alan, we talked about the inside-outside strategy, which is kind of the squaring of a circle of a polarity that some people have seen that I don't think is as polarized as, and clearly by your strategy, you don't either. There's another that I wanted to talk about a little because I feel it's very deeply embedded in the PDA strategy, and that's the split between those who look to politicians as leaders, as the ones who are going to fix it for us, and those who dismiss politicians as, they're sellouts, they're blah, blah, blah. I think implicit in the PDA strategy is a different way of looking at it, which tends to be the way I look at it, which is that politics are instruments of change and potentially partners of a movement, potentially recipients of a movement's energy, one way or the other. And so, you have the Mitch McConnells of the world who are already, we're not going to get much out of them. Let's put it that way. Then you have the AOCs and the Bernies who are going to be very much in our corner on most issues. And then you have all the others, right? And among them, I think rather than condemn them as tools of capitalism, which in many cases they may be, to be honest, I think what's implicit in what you guys do and implicit in a lot of what I do too, for example, or what I'm involved in, is you don't have to take them as your gurus or outsource your role as a citizen to make value judgments about what the country ought to do. You ought to use them as instruments of your will, which may mean presenting petitions, it may mean calling their office, it may mean cornering them and telling them, look, this is what we think, this is what the polling shows, your constituents agree with us. If they do, and if they don't, we try to make them agree, and persuade them to agree. And here's why you need to come along with us. So that's a rebalancing of the relationship between citizens and their elected officials. Is that sort of something you guys have looked at?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the truth is that including with the Democratic Party and with the exception of a few phases with the Republican Party, you look at the rise of the Reagan movement and the moral majority at the time, there really was a grassroots movement that was organized to push the Republican Party to the right. A lot of it took place, say, at the PTA level, these battles that took place in the 70s and 80s. But there was mobilization. The Democratic Party in the post-Bill Clinton era really became, you gave the cold shoulder to a great degree to direct citizen involvement inside the party. And of course, PDA exists to alter that. So the one thing that is really absent, if you go by congressional offices around the country, you're not going to find a lot of citizens knocking on the door. And of course, that is not the way that representative democracy is modeled to operate. It would be the way that the status quo wants it to operate. Certainly at this point in our society, the status quo is represented by the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, Wall Street, major corporations, et cetera. And we have this still little crack in the edifice of elite control in the society, which is the representative democratic operation. And when people do show up and petition their congressman, they hear it because it doesn't happen very often. Well, we want it to happen a lot, and PDA is very committed to making sure that they hear us, that we let them know that the public is supporting the policies that we are putting forward. And even in the rare cases where we don't have majority poll support for the policies we advocate for, we really believe ethically and morally we're on the right side. And we make that argument very strongly and let them know that we expect them to do the right thing in terms of voting for particular legislation. And if they don't, I think they understand the consequences. They spend a lot of their time trying to raise money from donors. Well, they're going to spend a lot more time scrambling and trying to get reelected if they don't support what their constituencies want and what's, again, best for the world and best for the American people.
So if I were to join the PDA tomorrow, which probably given your role, you would encourage me to do, what would I subjectively experience? What's it like to be a member of the PDA? What happens? I mean, obviously, people sometimes join groups and then don't follow through. But if I became an enthusiastic, active member of the PDA, what would I hear? What would I see? What would I be likely to do?
This being a national show, we focused almost exclusively on the way that I frame things are around national policy. So every PDA chapter that meets, and we have supporters all across the country in all 435 congressional districts. Active chapters, not so much, not close to 435, which of course is our goal. But we, of course, maybe it would be really 335 because in population centers, congressional district overlap. Certainly is the case where I live. And we have a very active chapter. We now have 2 501c4s that are partners with Progressive Democrats of America, and that allows for lobbying at the state and local level. So there is no crisis of what a PDA chapter does. If, say, you have 20 people, 40 people, 60 people, every elected official somebody will be designated as the liaison to that office. So from city council to county supervisor to state assembly member, state senate member, mayor, and then into the federal offices if there's a U.S. Senate office nearby for the senator, and of course the congressperson. And that designated person every month is going to take a visit to that office and advocate for the policies that PDA advocates for, develop a relationship with them. So there's no crisis of what to do in terms of a PDA chapter and chapter member. And of course, if you do have a really large chapter, we do want to have always one designated person to be the primary spokesperson to each office. We do have a very code of civility. We're not raising voices as any elected officials, even Republicans. Now, of course, as you can imagine, we do letter drops monthly. When we drop them at Republican offices, we get quite a cold shoulder very often, but we always maintain civility. But again, we have a designated spokesperson. There's nothing that says that a few people can't go on any of those visits to offices, even if one person is the designated spokesperson who develops the relationship with the elected official and their staff. So that's a local chapter activity. And again, it is really something that is absent, especially with developing relationships, the regularity of it. It's not a single issue orientation. We champion a broad range of issues. I think you and I have spoken about a big campaign that PDA is going to be involved in to support student debt cancellation that we are launching now. And there's a lot of energy that's built up around this again. There was some a few years ago, and now it's coming back. And of course, it's an essential thing that has to happen. What has happened to a whole generation of people stuck inside a quagmire of suffocating debt is unbelievably ridiculous and detrimental to the society and people's well-being. So there's that kind of issue. We've been on the front and center. One of the lead organizers from the time the organization existed for Medicare-for-All, single-payer Medicare-for-All. We had just passed a resolution in St. Petersburg, Florida, the PDA and the National Nurses United spearheaded along with Public Citizen to get resolutions passed across the country for Medicare-for-All. Of course, that's a resolution related to a federal project, and at the local level, we obviously campaign for actual binding legislation and stuff for the local levels. But we've been involved with the Medicare-for-All at the federal level campaign since its inception, since PDA came into existence, and we are one of the central organizations there to give an example.
So final question, Alan Minsky, and I'll ask it of you as an individual, as much or more so perhaps than in your role at PDA. You mentioned student debt, you mentioned Medicare-for-All, both of which are issues I care a lot about, among other reasons, because I think they represent an opportunity for us to debate and restore the social contract and the set of communitarian values, the sense that we're all in this together, that we have a responsibility to one another. Obviously, on the climate emergency, if we don't radically re-envision the way our relationship with the climate, at least in my view, we are in for enormous global tragedy, far greater than we've experienced so far. All that said, those goals are ambitious. Obviously, the stakes are high. How, on a personal level, how optimistic are you about the future?
Well, of course, oh boy.
Yeah, I know.
It goes
Sorry.
both ways. It goes both ways. Look, the climate emergency is obviously an existential crisis for humanity that we need to respond to in every. I mean, the news from Brazil around I could point to anything almost, the continued fossil fuel extraction, et cetera. But in Brazil right now with Bolsonaro, the rate at which the Amazon is being deforested has just accelerated tremendously. So there's really bad news. Of course, consciousness around the issue is growing, and we have to really just do everything we can to get organized to fight that as strongly and as powerfully as we possibly can. And by the way, we have to find a way in which we make clear to people who work in industries, we do not want labor or organized labor in any way, shape, or form to be our enemies on this. We need to make clear how workers are going to transition into new jobs and the protections that we can make available through programs to assure that that happens for them. But okay, the young generation in the United States currently is very enthusiastic about left progressive politics. Your dialogues with Nathan J. Robinson from Current Affairs are just one example, but they are unbelievably delightful and hopeful because I think Nathan J. Robinson does represent a younger generation that is thinking about socially transformative visions to create a world where we can be comfortable, where we don't work too hard, where we have prosperity, shared prosperity, higher quality education, healthcare, and just human liberty and freedom. And we support all of those things. Of course, we deal with the actual hard brass tacks work of how you get there from here. But there's real promise with where the younger generation is. And with that, there's a powerful thrust across all generations for the invigoration of progressive politics in the United States of America. Donald Trump is president. We have a global climate emergency. We have an incarceral state. We have incredible wealth inequality. And in Los Angeles, California, where I am currently, the plague of homelessness is everywhere you look when you're out on the streets. Yeah. We have a lot that we have to fight against. But we do have that, again, it's a paradoxical moment, and we have a lot of progressive momentum. We have to build upon that and achieve the transformations to make this, again, a society that we can be proud of living in and have really good lives inside of it.
Well, good answer to a tough question. And as T.S. Eliot said, between the dream and the reality falls the shadow. And here we are in the shadow. So Alan Minsky, Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America, an excellent group of shadow navigation specialists. Thanks for your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. It's been a delightful conversation. Thank you.